Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining today's ITCC member meeting. Today, for the agenda, we'll include some announcements, and then we will go into our presentation, Best Practice Translating Test Items, presented by John Kleeman, founder and executive director at Questionmark, as well as Steve Dept, CEO and founding partner of cApStAn. First, we'd like to remind everyone that the Innovation Award submissions are open. The nominations are open to all companies within the IT certification industry. ITCC membership is not required. It's to recognize any implementation of an innovative test, process, or service within the past 2 years. The product, service, or initiative must produce value for one or more stakeholders. The submission form can be found on the ITCC website. And then once you complete the first page, please email it to info@itcertcouncil.org. This could be something of yours that you are working on, or if you know of anybody at another company that you feel would fit, go ahead and encourage them to submit a nomination. Also, please save the date. We are having our spring in-person member meeting in March. There will be a member networking dinner Saturday evening, March 16th, and then the member meeting will be Sunday, March 17th in Orlando, Florida, along with the ATP conference. Also now open is our ITCC merchandise store. It is filled with fun ITCC gear, both apparel and home items and stickers. So check out the website with some great things to support ITCC, and there's some great items that you can wear at conferences or even our in-person meeting. A reminder of our task force schedules. They are going to remain going into the 2019 year. So if you are interested in joining one of the task forces or more than one task force, please email me at info@itcertcouncil.org and I will get you set up for that task force. So again, thank you everyone for joining, and thank you to our presenters. At this time, I will go ahead and turn it over.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm John Kleeman of Questionmark, and I'm giving this webinar with Steve Dept from cApStAn. Steve, do you just want to say hello, and we'll just do a sound check?
Yes, good morning, everybody. Thank you very much for giving us the privilege of this presentation on best practices in translation. It's an honor for us to be there.
So Steve is CEO and founder of cApStAn, who are a Belgian company who specialize in translation, particularly of assessments and linguistic quality control. He's got a lot of experience in test adaptation and linguistic quality control, as you'll discover shortly, and he's been involved in many linguistic quality assurance programs, including for the PISA, very large worldwide assessment. And I am the original founder of Questionmark and now executive director. I've got a quite scary 30 years experience in the assessment industry, and I've recently been elected as a director of the Association of Test Publishers, and I've got a fair amount of experience of translating tests over the years as well, and we'll seek to share with you today some of the best practices in translating tests. And if I can start with just saying that obviously for us English speakers, we do tend to think that if it can't be said in English, it isn't worth saying at all. But obviously, if you are seeking to deliver your assessment and measure fairly people in other languages, then it is really important to translate tests. and to translate tests well. And when you translate test items word for word, there is a risk of things going wrong or shifting in what things are being measuring. And what we're going to present today is about good practice to allow a test to measure the same thing across different languages and cultures. I won't go a lot about what Questionmark is, because I imagine that most of you will know us, and if not, you'll be more interested in the translating tests than us, but we've been founded since 1988. We provide assessment management systems for corporations, government, certification providers, and higher education. We are ISO 27001 certified, and we have a lot of different partnerships and accreditations. And if you could go to the next slide, Steve, we provide an assessment platform that allows you to create a secure surveys, quizzes, tests, and exams, then deliver them in a wide variety of different ways and report back on the results. We also provide candidate portals with e-commerce. We're a very multilingual system, and we've got 24/7 support. We've been involved in different language exams, multilingual exams, since at least the early 90s. I remember working with translators into Serbo-Croat and Finnish in the early 90s. Our first translation management system that allowed you to manage the translation of assessment into multiple languages were produced in 2010, and an early adopter of the system was SAP, who've used it to translate and deliver in over 20 languages. And the key capability of our system, and we'll talk about that a bit later and why it's important, is the ability to export text for translation outside the system and bring it back in. And just also congratulations to SAP for winning the ITCC Innovation Award this year for their certification in the cloud program. And with that, I'd like to just hand over to Steve to briefly introduce who cApStAn are.
cApStAn is a bit younger than Questionmark. We were founded in 2000, and we specialize in setting up and monitoring translation designs for multilingual tests and questionnaires. cApStAn has been in charge of translation quality in OECD PISA since its inception in 1998. It is a trusted language consultant for most major international large-scale assessments. In the private sector, we help testing organizations set up and document their translation process and increase the validity and reliability of the different language versions of their assessments. We have offices in Brussels and in Philadelphia, and partners in international organizations, national organizations, as well as in the private sector. So we have a holistic approach to test translation adaptation. There are 4 different stages in the localization project that start way before the translation begins. You'll see that only stage C is the actual translation adaptation process. Those numbers and letters represent 22 modules that are used a bit like building blocks to create the translation and localization design that best fits the needs and requirements of the organizations we work with. I'll ask John to run us through the agenda.
Yeah, so we're going to start off with a very brief comment on planning, because like many things, that is the most important thing, getting translation right. And then Steve's going to talk about designing a process and the things you need to think about in setting up the process. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the translation process if you use Questionmark as an exemplar. And then Steve's going to talk about translation technologies. I'm going to talk a little bit, I think both of us are going to talk a little bit about how you manage your translation vendor, because that's really important in terms of getting the right results for you. And then a little bit about piloting and checking equivalence. So basically just going through the process, the process in an overview. And we will be sharing, or I think Bristol will share for us, the slides at the end of the presentation. And if you've got questions, we'll have time for questions at the end. But if anything sort of urgently comes up or whatever, feel free to put it in the GoToMeeting message, and we'll get to it. So just a little bit on planning. So just like any other testing thing, you need to start with your purpose. Why is the test being developed? What's the construct or domain that's being measured? And what's being done with the pass-fail scores? So for mostly in the IT certification, it's very obviously that you're giving people a certificate, but you do need to be very precise about these things to be able to work about translating. And then you need to, it might be that for some certification exams, many certification exams, you might decide that English is your only language of delivery, but you need to look at what the population of your test takers is, what languages is reasonable for them to take the test in, and whether it's equitable and fair. So, for example, if you're setting things up and you need to be able to speak English to be able to use the software, then it may be reasonable to deliver the test just in English. But if it's an application which is itself translated into different languages, then you'll want to think about what languages it's sensible to them to take the test in, and also identify the target locales, and in some case any different cultures like US English, UK English, or Spanish South America, or Spanish in Spain. And once you've identified that, and obviously there's also a cost trade-off, you then want to seek advice as to whether the construct or domain has any issues in any of the languages or cultures. For example, if your questions talk about job roles, maybe that's different in the Far East than it is in the US, or it may be that the software itself has different aspects in different countries, and you also need to look at whether the item formats need adjusting. The most obvious thing is the right to left languages, but there can be other things as well. And once you've done this, then you define your objectives topics, and it's very helpful to progress some example items. So before you say translate 1,000 question item bank, translate a few and get that worked out so you can discover bumps in the road, and define your translation process, which Steve will talk about in a moment. And it can be very useful to do a kind of translatability assessment after the initial design, and particularly if you're translating into a lot of different languages. There are languages families out there, and you can find that the same question might have issues in several different languages, and if you do an assessment, it can make sense. And with that, I'd like to hand over to Steve, who's going to talk about designing the process.
So designing the process would be making informed decisions about the translation, adaptation, and linguistic quality assurance design for your test. It's going beyond the approach of saying, now my test is ready, just get it translated so I can bring it on another market. It's a bit more complex than that. It doesn't need to be this complex. This is the typical translation adaptation design for international large-scale assessments, such as TIMSS or PIAC or PISA, but it's way too complex for the majority of assessment ecosystems. But you could do something along these lines. So here in green, you would have work done by the testing organization and the local partner, perhaps. Dark red would be a test localization consultant, and blue would be your preferred vendor. And in tan in the middle, we've put a subject matter expert who can come from different backgrounds. Now, deciding who does each of these stages and preparing a workflow to do this in a well-organized way is absolutely crucial to the success of your localization project. Now remember this holistic approach we showed at the beginning. Here you have the names of the 22 modules. Of course, we don't have time to explain what each of these modules entitle, so I've just selected 3 of the very important best practice modules that are often underused and make a lot of difference. And one of them is in the source optimization process. It's the creation of project-specific rules, and 2 other modules are in the preparation of the translation process. Creating project-specific rules is writing rules that can be linked to the various attributes of your test, of your English source version, if it's in English. For example, you can define the maximum number of characters in captions. Can be very important when you know that the expansion rate between English and Finnish is 1.25. It's 1.12 for Portuguese and 1.18 for Italian. But if you don't calculate at least 30% extra space for the different boxes of your legends under your graphs, you may have a problem. So you can define that. You can define forced adaptations if you have imperial measures that you want in metric in countries that do not use imperial measures. You can identify the policy you're going to use for gender in your test. Do you have a gender-specific version, gender-neutral? Do you have a male and a female version? Determine For example, the proportional length of response choices. That's a very interesting one. I'll show you in the next slide. And remember that when we program those rules in advance, they can always be checked automatically. You can check compliance with the rules at the end of the translation process. So this is about distractors and keys. If you program in advance that the respective length of the responses of your multiple choice items should remain the same across languages, you will avoid problems such as this one. And this is a serious problem because the literature tells you that if a correct response sticks out, or if a distractor sticks out, the undecided respondent is likely to pick the one that sticks out. And so if you have a correct translation that makes something stick out that doesn't stick out in the source version, you're changing the psychometric properties of your items with a correct translation just because you haven't respected the proportional length of key and distractors. So these are things to think about when programming the localization. Again, this can be checked automatically. Creation and maintenance of glossaries, that's really part of best practice. Many good vendors will propose this. It's part of the pre-translation, but we do find it remains underrated, underused. And these glossaries do need to be built according to strict rules that will allow automatic checking afterwards, and they need to be validated by subject matter experts in the target culture. It does involve a little bit of work, upstream work, but the quality gains in creating a glossary, a bilingual glossary, are absolutely immense, and certainly in domain-specific assessments. You could put a variety of things in your glossaries, such as the terms and words that need to be translated consistently, the fictitious names, recurring prompts, acronyms, the names of the buttons, tables, or user interface elements can be very important because your translators don't always know what the best approach is. This is an example of terms in a test that might require a glossary entry. And once you have entered those in your glossary, again, they can be checked automatically by the quality control software that you're going to be using. If there's one takeaway for today's session that I personally would like to insist on, it's translation adaptation notes. Not just a document, 3, 4, 5-page document that tells translators what they would be have to be careful about. Now, prepare really these item per item translation adaptation notes that are clear and concise. Very often the item developers, the test authors, already develop some translation adaptation notes, giving an idea about the construct, about the question intent. We as linguists, we often prepare specific translation adaptation notes that will help translators circumvent certain problems, respecting matches and patterns. For example, if you have a literal match between the text and the question that asks something about the text, that literal match must be respected in the target languages. And you have to avoid the translator effect, where a translator is proud of having a broad vocabulary and shows off by using 5 different words to say the same thing, whereas in your test you're only using 2 words, and that would increase the level of difficulty and change the cognitive strategy that is used to answer the question. One great advantage would be having those translation adaptation notes and setting up a process, a design in which your translation vendor needs to confirm that they have read it. They have to click something. I have read the translation adaptation note. And your reviewers, your verifiers who check the translation afterwards, they need to confirm in writing that the translation note has been addressed. And you already have a basic level of quality control that takes you very far. I was wondering, maybe John, you can say a few words about the translation process in Questionmark now.
Yeah, sure. And just before I do that, can I just reinforce what Steve has just said? A little bit of effort at the beginning of the project, making a glossary, doing these notes, can add a lot of value during the process, because if you make mistakes during the process and got to go back and repeat them, which you only find out in the piloting or even post-go live phase, it's really very expensive. And things like a glossary, just making sure that if you have terms in your software or system, that make sure that when they're translated in different questions are the same thing, or they match you probably got a glossary for your whole product if it's being translated. So these little sort of things, they aren't that they're a time saver rather than a time sink. They're really worthwhile. In terms of Questionmark, there are 2 routes in, and I'm just going to give you a sort of 5-minute or perhaps even less than 5-minute tour around the Questionmark translation management system. There are 2 routes of translating, and just to clarify, Questionmark doesn't actually translate the material for you. It manages the translation process, and you can either do it on the fly within the Questionmark user interface, but really for any sort of thorough professional translation, you should be exporting it out for a third-party translation and then importing it back in. And once Steve explains the kind of technology he uses or translators typically use for translating material, you'll see why that's important. So you export it, get it translated using third-party tools, and then import it back again. If you could move to the next slide, Steve. So the process in a little bit more detail is you create it in one language, you'll then export it into XLIF, the translator translates it into the other languages, then you import it back as the translated XLIF, review it in the system, adjust as needed and published, and then go live. And then also, almost as important as the initial process is that the system prompts you to translate changed or updated items, because obviously as you translate, it isn't just a one-time job that you translated, you need to be continually translating updates as they happen. And a little bit about XLIF. Steve, if you could go forward. This is called XML localization interchange file format, and it's kind of a structured text with tags, and it's an international standard from Oasis, who create a lot of other open data standards, and it's reasonably well supported by translation tools. Most translation tools will bring it in, allow it. And then within Questionmark, we have a concept of an item bank containing the content and then published assessments, and all the translation happens prior to publishing. So you create the item bank in your original language, whether that's English or something else, and then translate it into the translated content with the translation management system, and then you publish it, and it gets delivered, and the results get stored. And if you make amends, then you amend the original content and or the translated content and republish. And just to give you a sort of flavor for the kind of things it looks like on the screen, we'd be happy to give a demonstration to anybody who wants. Just ping me or Kristin, and we'll happily schedule a longer demonstration. You can sort of download, export the XLIF, either all the text or text not previously downloaded, and include subtopics, and then import it back again. Steve, if you could move to the next slide. So when you import it, you can see there, you just click on this. It's all a very easy process to export it for translation and import it back again, and then you can try it out within Questionmark, and if you want to make adjustments. So this is showing you that you can go through and make manual adjustments if you want to. See the base language on the screen there, and then the target. So I imagine this gives you a flavor of the translation management system, and as I said earlier, if you want to have a more detailed run through, we'd be happy to do that offline. But what I'd like now is to pass back to Stephen to explain the kind of translation technologies that organizations typically use, and why it is so valuable to use a separate translation technology that you can export to, rather than having to just do it all within the user interface of an assessment management system. Over to you, Steve.
Thank you, John. Okay. I would like the audience to excuse me if they already know all this. People who are familiar with the translation environment all know that a computer-aided translation tool, or CAT tool, is not the same as machine translation. But I think it's important to remind that, because a third-party app that we would use for the translation does not do any translation. It does something else. And so the cat tool is a specialized program. They've been around for a quarter of a century now, for over 25 years. They're pretty sophisticated by now. They're programs that help the translator increase their productivity and obtain a very high degree of consistency by leveraging what we call language assets. I'll say a word about that just now. And the most important language asset may be the translation memory. The translation memory is something that you build as you translate. And whenever you come across a sentence or segment that you have already translated, then your previous translation pops up and you can decide to reuse it or not. So of course, the translation memory is only useful if you have a good translator, because if you take over translation memory from an average translator, it's not going to help you that much. And so the translation quality really depends on the human translator when you use a cat tool. Machine translation, conversely, is artificial intelligence. Initially, it only used rules like cApStAn, a set of 16 rules through which the sentences were run, and then it came up with an estimate of what a correct translation could be. Then there is large sets of data. We call them corpora. There is statistics-based machine translation, as Google Translate initially did. And more recently, there are machine learning algorithms and deep learning in particular that make predictions also based on the regularity of input of the people who work with those machines. So you can train a machine to translate the way you want to translate. So these machine translations are indeed computer-generated translations, in which case the translation quality will depend on the quality of the data sets that you have trained your machine with and on the algorithms that are being used. And some are quite useful, and so we do see that a number of translation vendors are now pivoting towards machine translation first and then human post-edition. I will not give my own opinion on that. We tend not to use this because we don't think that technology is quite mature at this stage, but we experiment with it. So language assets, that may have been an unfamiliar word for some of you. So the language assets is what we call everything that the translator needs to do his or her work correctly. There would be the source files, that's the text of your assessment, of your test. Can be Word, can be Excel, can be HTML. A number of key terms definitions, a bilingual glossary, if you've prepared that. It can be an Excel or a Word table, but something that already sets consensus about key terms, repetitive terms, jargon-specific terms in your assessment. Then perhaps some guidelines. They could be in Word, Excel. You see a number of guidelines out there, even PDF. And then reference files. There are materials that have been translated from a previous cycle of your assessment in that language. And all of that is given to the translator and now produce something of high quality, that is consistent, that is coherent. That's the prehistoric approach. With a good cat tool, you put all these resources inside a cat tool where you have specific repositories for each of them, and you just give the linguist a link and they download a project package. You may think it's just packaging, but no, not really, because there's an OASIS standard for the source. That's the XLIF that John has described before us. There's a standard for the term base. That's the TBX format. There's a standard for translation memory, the TMX standard, which means that if you work with one vendor and you require that they give you the translation memory, and you're satisfied with the quality, but you have to work with another vendor or another assessment, you can give that other vendor the translation memory, and it will pre-translate anything that already looks like what was translated before. And of course, the translator is then free to use it, edit it, or reject it. But having all of that grouped into one cat tool makes the work much more productive and will give economies of scales. Perhaps John can add a few words about how you would manage the translation vendor.
Yeah, absolutely. And but the first thing I think is just to be in charge of the process. Don't let the translation vendor talk you into their approach, particularly if they're not a specialist assessment translation vendor, work out what you want. Also, as Steve has just covered, the translation memories being a really important thing. So they should also be part of your deliverable from the translation project, because that means that if you change translators, you can reuse the memories, and you've paid for those memories to be made. So they should be part of the deliverables. Also, just make sure you document the steps in the workflow so that you know everything that's happened. Any reputable translator wouldn't try and do anything differently, but generally translators should translate into their mother tongue. So say, for example, somebody was born in France but now lives in the US, then they can translate from English into French, but not from French into English. Obviously also, and this can be a challenge with some more obscure subjects, it is desirable if translators do understand the subject that they are translating into. And a good way, if you're choosing a translation vendor, and I have no stake in the game here at all. Questionmark does not do any kind of translation. Ask to see a document on how they recruit and evaluate their linguists, because that will help you understand whether or not how sophisticated their policies and processes are. And for large projects or high stakes projects, it's a very good idea to have independent linguistic QA, whether that's within your organization or a separate organization like cApStAN or something else, because that just helps you check that the process is working and gives you additional validity and confidence. Also, something that in the certification industry we need to be very careful about, we wouldn't want to have leaks during the translation process of question content. So make sure there's secure file transfer, both when you are communicating with the translation vendor, but also make sure that the translation vendor themselves, when they're communicating with the translators, who will often be home workers because of all the different languages involved, make sure there is a secure file transfer in process, and ideally not email. Also make sure that there are NDAs, confidentiality agreements in place with all translators to protect question security. We often think about that with our authors, but you've also got to think about it with the translators, and the translators often will not understand the assessment world or the certification world, or how important it is to keep assessment content secure. So you might want to do some simple training there as well as the NDAs. And then back to you, Steve.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll have this slide to summarize a bit that ideally there's quite a lot happening before the translation actually begins, and there is linguistic quality assurance once the translator has finished his or her work, and ideally that would be done by an external organization. So there's first the work done by the platform architects, and if you have the opportunity, if you design tests and if you work with a firm like Questionmark or another platform, is if it's possible to already involve a translation technologist in the creation of your process, so that they can advise you on parsing and segmentation so that correctly formed XLIFs are formed, it will save you many headaches further down the line. Ensure that there is good project management, either in your organization or by a translation consultant like cApStAN, or even the translation vendor if it's a larger company like the Line Bridges or RWSs of this world. There is upstream work to be done with guidelines, glossaries, and the like that should be done before the translators, the linguists, get the material. The linguists just get links to a project and have to produce a target version, and then there should be some form of quality assurance at the end. That's why we really like to work with firms like Questionmark. That's why we partner with Questionmark. It's because they understand this best practice, and their platform allows export of a well-formed XLIF, so that we can have linguists working in an optimal working environment and making the most of their language assets, and then it's imported back seamlessly. Not all platforms offer this. About the quality assurance, A complex process is the translation verification, and that's for high-stakes assessments or very sensitive assessments. And the literature will tell you that by now, most players in the field regard back translation as obsolete and insufficient, because back translate might help you detect some severe mistranslations, but back translation will not tell you anything about fluency in the target language, about appropriateness of register in the target language. And moreover, it is known that a literally translated test does not work well, but scores well on the back translation scale. And that's why over the years now, there's an alternative procedure that has more success. It's called translation verification. It's what we do in PISA, PIAC, TIMSS, and other international large-scale assessments. It's really a segment-by-segment comparison of source and target files. The verifiers have to check compliance with all those translation adaptation notes we described earlier. They're taught to focus on semantic equivalence and on the level of difficulty. We have a database of linguistic features that carry the psychometric properties of the items, and the linguists used to review tests know those different notions and look at that very carefully. Of course, while they're at it, they will check your grammar and your spelling, but I don't think that's the core part of the assessment. Our verifiers use standardized verifier intervention categories to report issues. So they have to label the diagnosis of a problem, and they have to describe all issues in a centralized monitoring tool. There are various designs for quality assurance, but documentation is always a plus, whoever you work with. The reviewers typically will propose their corrective action directly in the target files. So that's also a problem with back translation. You get a few problems that are identified, then you have to do something about it. If you work with verifiers, they will diagnose the problem and propose corrective action, which in a well-created translation design, either the vendor or the client will actually approve or reject the changes. And there has to be a verification report, and it should include data on the translation quality. So, for example, here you have 14 different intervention categories that verifiers use. They select whenever they want to report on the quality of your translated assessment. There are various scores and ratios. There's a pass-fail mark for the quality of the translation. If it's below the threshold, you can verify the entire assessment. If it's above the thresholds on a sample-based verification, then you can leave it at that. Very, very complex processes, but they add a lot of value and increase the reliability and validity of your test in various languages. Of course, the next stage would be to pilot and to check equivalence. And I think John will say a few words about this.
Yeah. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with the concept of piloting, but essentially you want to do some piloting in at least some of the target languages, if not all of the target languages. You should finalize the translation first before you pilot, because otherwise you want to be reasonably confident that the translation is good before you do pilot it. And you can get a lot of information out of the pilot data. And I think there's kind of two elements of it. So there's the sort of item statistics that you can use to get data out of it, and you can also do the sort of linguistic quality assurance. So there was a very good seminar earlier in the year run by the OECD in Paris, and it's clear that there are two different angles here. So there's the linguistic quality control, checking things from a language point of view, and then there's a psychometric thing of looking at the item analysis and the details there, and they both can pinpoint issues. Also, qualitative feedback from pilot test takers can be really useful. Either you interview them afterwards, or you put a little comment box by each question asking them to improve it, and that can be very useful. And of course, you'll want to run the item analysis, and if you can do run it by language and identify discrepancies. A very simple thing to do is to just compare the means of a difficulty of a question in two different languages, and that can often spot either questions where the translation has made the question much easier, or else where the translation has become ambiguous and made the question harder. So if you're just doing a sort of a high-level skim and you don't have the resources to do more detailed, looking at the difficulty of the questions in different languages can be great. But obviously, if you can do, you want to run a full item analysis and look at issues there. And this is just a screenshot of a typical item analysis in Questionmark, flagging questions with a low discrimination or in red. I think this is your slide, Steve.
Yes, I'll jump back on what you said, that there are two different types of quality assurance. One is more the formal psychometric aspect of the analysis, and the other one is the linguistic aspect. So when items that have behaved in an unexpected way, and there's differential item functioning, or there's bias, and criteria are flagged, then those reports, those item analysis reports, can be examined both by the testing organization, by the linguistic reviewer, and even possibly by the local subject matter expert, and come up with explanations of why such results may have occurred. That can be for a variety of reasons. And sometimes the test authors will propose corrective action that then needs to be implemented by the linguist. And sometimes it's the other way around. The linguists identify corrective action that then has to be endorsed by the test developers. And then you're ready. Then you can go live. We do have lots of sources of information for translation best practices. An important one is the International Test Commission's guidelines on adapting tests. There's a book came out last year by Dragoș Iliescu, who has been the chair of the International Test Commission. It's Adapting Tests in Linguistic and Cultural Situations. Make really commendable reading, but it's a thick brick of a book, but it's excellent. The PISA guidelines, I don't think everything in the PISA guidelines is useful for testing organizations, but the PISA program was really a pioneer in implementing high-quality translations in multilingual assessments, and they're very well constructed. Those guidelines. Questionmark has a blog. cApStAn has a blog as well. I think in the interest of time, because we want to leave you a little bit of time for questions, we'll summarize the key takeaways from today's presentations. And the first one, also confirmed by numerous tests and by the literature, is that increasingly best practice is to embed the translation, the localization is test design. So whenever possible, if you're writing items, if you're writing tests that are earmarked for translation at some point, think of translation early, involve translation specialists early and translation technologists early, and it will save you many headaches. Like John said before, any time spent on optimizing the source version, any time spent on preparing the translation adaptation process thoroughly, on investing in a glossary and item-by-item notes, and you'd be amazed how low an investment that is in comparison with the total budget of going multilingual. Any of this time spent early in the game drives the quality of the translated tests, something we'd really like to hammer on, because it's so undervalued that these few weeks of work before you start translating make a whole difference. Also part of this practice is to have some possibility, technical possibility, to export out of your assessment system so that the translators can make the best of their translation technology. And certainly for high stakes tests, to organize at least some perhaps sample-based independent quality checks of the translations. I think that leaves us just about enough time to answer the questions you may have, with both John and I would be delighted to answer.
A deadly silence there. If anybody has any questions, feel free. I appreciate this is a fairly heavy subject, and either if you're not involved in it, then it may be just for information, or if you're involved, you've probably got your own processes and systems. But I think the key message here, like Steve just been saying, is that there are some good practices in translating tests, and if you follow them, then it will make it much more successful.
At any rate, if you know your translation needs and you know your options before you embark on the journey of producing multiple language versions of your assessments, you make a good head start. And if you wish, you can request a free translation needs and requirements analysis by a senior consultant at cApStAn. Also, if you already have a language service provider and you have translated tests at hand already, you can ask us to organize a sample-based translation quality evaluation and an equivalence check at cApStAn. These addresses will be on the slides. I think Questionmark also is available to
yes,
give demos.
If you would like to have a demo of the Questionmark system, then please reach out to us either on one of the URLs here, either a demo or a trial, or for those of you who know Kristen or Brian or any of our team, just reach out to them and they can arrange it, and we'd be delighted to give any of you a demonstration. I think there's a comment there from Susan saying not quite there for translating exams. We are doing glossaries. Yeah, I think glossaries are also useful just for test design in general, because we want to make sure that people use the same language, even if you're just creating material in English.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. So questions can be in writing, or you can ask them aloud.
Okay, so I think Bristol, perhaps back to you to close down the meeting, or anything else you want to say?
I would just like to thank you again for presenting. There was a lot of useful information. We will be posting the video on our YouTube channel. Also, the slides will be available in the Google Drive, and so look for the link in your recap email. And of course, if you do have any questions afterwards that you would like to ask them, you can either, go ahead. I thought I heard someone say they had a question. We might have lost you. Like I said, the presentation will be available, and so you can either reach out to the email addresses that they provided within the presentation, or you're always welcome to send any questions to info@itcertcouncil.org, and if I don't know the answer, I will find it for you. So thank you again to our presenters, and everyone, please have a wonderful rest of your Thursday.
Thank you very much for your time, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye-bye.